Easter is 7 days away. How are you going to leverage this historic day? How are you going to leverage your invitations? How are you going to leverage your relationships? How will you leverage your prayers? For those of you in the room who are like, that rooftop prayer thing sounds awesome, but I'm afraid you guys will ask me to pray out loud, we won't. Okay? But you don't want to miss this. This is the only time our landlord has given us permission for a rooftop church event, okay? And so even if you don't even believe in prayer, all right? Come Thursday night, 7 o'clock. It's going to be a great time. 7 o'clock, get off work if you have to early, cancel with your friends, bring your family that's in town with you, whatever. You're not going to want to miss this, so that on the back end, when we see God do some amazing things, you will understand. And what we want to teach ourselves is we will understand that when nobody's looking, there are people praying, and sometimes God is simply doing great things by responding to our prayers. And so this Thursday night, 7 o'clock, bring your kids with you, bring your family, whatever. Going to be a great time. We will be During that time, obviously you guys probably know, but the sun will set, stars will come out if it's clear, and we're going to be looking over much of this Soma area and just the rest of our city and asking God, would you do something unprecedented in our midst through Easter? God, would you do something that we haven't seen? God, would you bring my friend to faith? God, would you give me courage to invite them? And so be leveraging what it is that this historic day offers us. For me, kind of my message next week, I think it's the message of Easter, but the slant for me next week is this idea that when you think something's over, sometimes it's just beginning. And so as you have friends who feel like their relationship have caused life to be over, their financial mishaps, life has been over for them, they trusted in God at some point in time and he didn't come through in the way they wanted him to. It's going to be a great message really about how sometimes when we think something is dead and gone and over, sometimes it's just beginning to have life. And so look forward to that out of Luke chapter 24 next week. Feel free to read ahead. Today, we put a period at the end of this Rejecting Status Quo series. And for those of you who have been a part of this series with us, you know from my heart and what we're seeing God do over these last 7 weeks in our church, this is going to be a tough one to set aside, but I'm excited. Luckily, it's Easter next week, and so I'll be okay. I'll manage somehow. If there's anything I love more than this series, it's getting the opportunity to share with many people on Easter Sunday, really that day that's so representative of our entire faith. And so looking forward to that. And we're putting a period on this. My first introduction 7 weeks ago in this series went something like this. None of us wake up in the morning longing to live average, ordinary, mediocre lives, but most of us will. None of us, who longs to be average? None of you woke up every morning going to school thinking, if I could just get a C, well, some of you did. Some of you did get to that point where like a C was a win. And we probably all had some class where that was the case, right? But none of us want to be average, but most of us will unless we come to grips with the idea and the reality that there's a big God able to do anything that seems impossible. And unless we understand that God has given us wealth, He's given us gifts, He's given us passions, He's stirred things in our hearts for specific purposes. And if we're willing to utilize and leverage those things in our life, then we can set aside maintaining the status quo by rejecting the status quo and pursuing the things God has for us. But we'll never live that kind of life unless we believe God's able, which we continue to just throw out as a theme here, unless we believe God is able and unless we're willing to realize whatever He's given to us has an intended purpose. And so that's what we're about. Last week we started by being introduced to 4 young Jewish men who were part of the Jews who were captured by Nebuchadnezzar and sent to Babylon. Those men were Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and basically they were part of this kingdom where Nebuchadnezzar was so full of himself. He builds a golden image 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and he says when you hear any musical instrument played, you are to bow down and you are to worship that image, and if you don't, bad things are going to happen. And everyone bowed down. That was the status quo in Babylon. If you hear the musical instruments played, you bow down. That's what everyone did. Everyone except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And remember, when everyone's doing something and you're doing something different, especially when they're kneeling and you're standing, you kind of stand out, right? And so they sort of stood out. But Nebuchadnezzar, a man of grace and mercy, actually not, you'll see that in a second, but he says to him, I'm going to give you one more opportunity. When you hear the musical instruments, if you bow well and good. But if you don't, I'm going to throw you in this sounds redundant, but burning, fiery furnace, okay? You're going to hear that phrase a lot, so just don't hate the preacher. Just, don't hate anybody, but you're just thinking like burning, fiery furnace. So just making a point about how hot this thing is. And if you don't bow down, you're going to be thrown in there. And then who is the God who will be able to deliver you then? And they said, oh, Nebuchadnezzar, the God whom we serve is able to deliver us. Big faith, God is able. But even if he doesn't, our worship isn't for sale. We will not bow down and worship you or your gods. You guys want to see how it finishes? Pretend like you don't know, all right? If you need a Bible, raise your hand. We'd love to give you one. For the rest of us, we'll pick up exactly where we left off. If you get one of these gift Bibles, we're on page 480. For the rest of us, Daniel chapter 3. We finished last week in verse 18, so you might imagine where we'll be starting this morning. Daniel chapter 3, verses 19 through 30. If you've got your own Bible, it's between Ezekiel and Hosea. And then would you all stand with me so we can look at this together? Because the big question as we wrap up this series is this: what happens on the back end of a life that rejects the status quo? What's the end result? What is it for? How does God use it? What happens? Or is it just about living this great faith life and nothing really takes place on the back end? I want you to see it. Daniel chapter 3, we're going to read 12 verses, 19 through 30. The reason we're looking at this extensive text is because I don't want you to miss what we're going to pull out of this entire story. So here we go. So they've just rejected Nebuchadnezzar. That made him real happy. Verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed. I can remember when I would tell my parents something and their facial expressions would change. They're just like, no, we're not going to do it. He's like infuriated. His face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so he's using the strongest guys, and to cast them into the burning, fiery furnace. Everybody gets that, right? Hot. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the, yeah. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. I think my staff should start answering me sort of in that way. Like, hey guys, did this happen? True, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb. He's still wicked. And their house is laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. And then the king, or rather God, expands their platform. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. You may be seated. Isn't it crazy? You're thrown into the fire 1 minute, the next minute you get a promotion. It's crazy. It's really crazy. So Nebuchadnezzar gets furious, and he's going to heat. Fire is fire, right? Now, the chemists in the room are saying, no, Ben, the blue flame's hotter than the orange flame, and I did the Bunsen burner thing. Okay, I didn't do great. That was one of my C classes probably in high school. But he wants to have his superiority stand out again. And so he wants the thing heated 7 times hotter than it already is. Like they're going to burn anyway. This is the furnace that everyone else that's gone against the king has been thrown into, and it's worked pretty well. But just because he feels slighted, because he wants to make a point, he heats the fire 7 times hotter than normal. That's hot. That's hot. Come on, you brilliant scientists in the room. What kind of degrees are we talking about for a minimum fire? Just give that to me.
800 degrees.
800 degrees? Minimum. So 7 times. It's huge. In fact, it's so hot that those who are going to throw these 3 men into the fire, they end up burning to death themselves. Pretty hot, right? Which brings up this great principle that has run all throughout the Rejecting Status Quo series, but I want to give it to us for the first time this morning. Here it is. God's favor can distinguish us from others who are a part of the same things we are. God's favor can distinguish us from others who are a part of the same things we are. Now, sometimes those other people who are going for what we're going after, sometimes God, because of who they are, God will oppose them. But sometimes it's not that they're evil people. It's just if God wants you to have the job, even though there are other good people applying for it, you're going to get the job. That's what this idea is about, that God's favor can distinguish us, can mark our life so that as we attempt the same things as 1 million other people or 100 other people or 10 other people, what our outcome can look like is that it can look different than what theirs looks like. Was this fire hot? Some of you might go, wait a minute, Ben, the reason that they didn't burn because it just wasn't hot enough. Wait, it was hot enough to kill those who were close to it. Do you remember when either from watching the movie or from actually reading in the Bible, do you remember when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea to get away as they were fleeing Egypt? About 2 million of them. About 2 million of them. God brings this strong wind, it dries up the sea, they're able to walk through, but they're not the only ones who tried to get across the Red Sea that day, are they? What happened when the Egyptians tried to cross the same sea? God's like, oh, no more dryness. Psh, they drown. Why? Because when God's favor is on something, it can be a distinguishing factor. And 1 million people could attempt what you're trying to attempt, but if God's unique favor is on you, you might be the one who gets to enjoy what God wants to do. Were there other 100-year-old men around Abraham? Probably. Did any of the rest of them help their 90-year-old wife deliver a child? Those of you that remember from week 2, and I know it's a long time ago, but remember what it said about Abraham? He was as good as dead, because the logical thing there is that he could have no business becoming a father at the age of 100. Do we think that Esther was the only beautiful woman who had the opportunity for the king to choose her as queen? He had access to every beautiful woman. But when God's favor is on something, it can be the distinguishing factor. That's why if you say to your pastor, if I could pray for one thing the rest of my life, what should I pray for? What's your pastor going to tell you? God's favor. God's favor, distinguishing. It's the mark. It's a thing that can make a situation completely different than it appears today. For Shauna and I, we saw our kids get into an amazing school here in San Francisco, and we were the last ones to apply for the school year, and we have met countless people who have tried to get into the same school. It doesn't mean God doesn't like them, all right? It doesn't mean he likes us better either, okay? But somehow God's favor has allowed certain things to happen. Can you see God's favor as a distinguishing mark in your life? I mean, you don't think you were the only one who was qualified for the job you have, do you? This is where all the arrogant people stand up and be like, yeah, Ben, you don't know what I've got. those of you that have homes in San Francisco and you think you just got chosen randomly, you don't think you're the only person that tried to get into that home, do you? You ever been to an open house in San Francisco? Like, here's my resume. Like, we'll disown our kids if you'll let us in. I mean, whatever it is, right? It could be true that in the future, this probably is likely true one day in our church, because you guys are filling this room up, okay? We're going to have to do something with. One day we're going to need a bigger space. Chances are we will not be the only organization putting a proposal in for space. Not only that, chances are we will not have the biggest savings account when we do. Chances are we won't have a brand that's been around as long as some of the other tenants that are going to put in for that space. But God's favor can distinguish us, can it not? And so everyone else is burning up. And these guys, not only are they not burning, they're just hanging out in the fire. And then look at verse 24. Nebuchadnezzar is astonished, and it says that he rises up in haste. Listen to the question. Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? 2 things you need to notice here. The number 3 and the word bound. 3 men bound. 3 men bound. And they're like, true, O king. He says, well, then I am seeing things. He says, but I see how many? 4. And they're unbound. He uses his mightiest men to bind these 3 men. He uses his strongest soldiers to bind these guys. They are tied up. And some of you are like, no, Ben, they probably didn't do the routine correctly, because what I learned at the academy is you got to, no, they're tied up. They're bound when they get thrown into the fire. The fire is so hot that it's killed the people who tried to throw them in. Did we not bind 3 men? Then why in the world do I see 4 men who are unbound? Now, scholars are not clear if this is the physical presence of Jesus Christ or if it's perhaps just an angel sent by God. But what is clear is that there's a demonstration of God's physical presence in the midst of the fire, wouldn't you think? And he says in the 4th one, he's like a son of the gods. Which leads me to a statement I want to give you. And before I put it up there, it's going to sound to some of you like spiritual jargon. It's going to sound to others of you like, that is crazy. It's going to even sound to me sometimes in the way that I live like, I don't know. But here it is. The presence of God in our lives is better than the absence of problems. The presence of God in our lives is better than the absence of problems. You're like, Ben, you don't know my problem. My response might be, you don't know my God. Could these men have avoided the fire? Their problem. How could they have avoided the problem? But had they avoided the fire, my hunch is that they would have forfeited the presence of God in their lives. And some of us are in things that are so overwhelming to us, they're so defeating to us, that some of us in this very room, if we had the choice for the problem to go away, but it meant we had to forfeit God's presence in our life, some of us are facing something so strong right now that we would say, Ben, I'm in. I don't care what I have to forfeit. I just need the problem to go away. You'll try any religion to make the thing go away. You'll try any medication to make the thing go away. You'll move to any country that you have to make the thing go away. And I know it's tough, but sometimes what we choose is to have the absence of the problems, but then we know we're also willingly forfeiting the presence of God in our lives. And I just want to beg you to recognize this as reality in my life and in your life and in the life of our church. God among us is better than problems being gone from us. And if you've never walked in a personal relationship with God, 2 things. One is you can before you leave this room, no matter what you're even believing right now. Number 2 is you probably will reject this statement. Until you've sensed God's nearness when life sucks, you don't know this to be true. Until you've sensed his nearness when the world wasn't going right. Because let's be honest, We're all great with our faith when the world is rocking, aren't we? And I'm not saying this is easy. Lost my mom 10 years ago to cancer. If somebody said today, Ben, if you're willing to forfeit your relationship with God, I'll give you 25 years with your mom. I'm not saying I'll answer that quickly. Oh, you're the pastor. I'm just telling you the truth. I'm not saying that would be a bygone conclusion, but I think at the end of the day, because I know my mom's heart, first of all, like, you know what? God's nearness to me is better than my mom seeing my grandkids, her grandkids. God's presence in my life, especially because of moments like that, is what's most necessary. But you'll be tempted to do the opposite. You'll be tempted to go, you know what? If our marriage can get healed, I don't even care if we never go to church again a day in our life. I'm going to do whatever it takes. God wants to heal your marriage. He wants to overcome your depression. He wants to break the cycle of your addiction. Don't go pursue other sources. He's enough. He's enough. And here's how I know he's enough. Look as this text goes along. In verse 27, all of the government officials and Nebuchadnezzar, it says that they look and they see that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. 3 ways they saw this. The hair of their heads was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed. And I really like this third one. No smell of fire had come upon them. Fellas, we know if we get too close to the grill while we're grilling burgers, we're going to smell pretty bad for a while, right? You got to shower. You got to get those fingernails clean. At 350, 400 degrees. They don't even smell like fire. You couldn't even tell they had been near the flames. The reason I love this, if you look at it, it says the fire did not have any power over their bodies. Is there anything more powerful? Maybe a couple of things, but is there anything more powerful than fire? Not many things, right? You guys have seen fire. It can destroy apartment buildings. It can destroy a restaurant. It can bring warmth to a situation that's freezing, right? Power of a fire is huge. And the reason I love that it's fire, not because you and I are usually going to be dealing with physical fires, but many of you in this room are dealing with things that are so overpoweringly powerful in your life. And what you need to know is that if God can render a powerful fire as powerless, maybe he can render that thing you're up against as powerless too. There are things that you're facing right now. I know some of you in this room are in a depressed state of mind. I know that some of you are so addicted to something and have been since you were a teenager, you don't know how to shake it. I know that some of you are in such an unfortunate place financially that there is no way out and you're willing to do whatever it takes. I know that some of you have situations at your jobs and with your bosses and with your employees and with your moms and dads and with your kids. It is so overpowering. Only thing you can imagine is that I am ultimately going to be defeated by this. But if God can be so powerful to rend something as a 7 times heated up fire as powerless, perhaps he can make the overpowering forces in your life powerless too. Don't lean away from this God who can do this. Lean into this God who can do this. What are the overpowering things that you're facing? That you need to hold fast to this idea that God can render them powerless. Because if we're going to reject the status quo, you need to know, as an individual, marriages, families, our vocations, as a church, we are going to face constant overpowering situations. But isn't it amazing to know that the powerful God is able to render those things powerless? Do you know how likely it was that we found a church building to meet in Soma 2 years ago that was already zoned for 200 people in this room? Anybody know how likely that was? When our brokers ran the market analysis, guess how many spaces showed up? Guess how many spaces we needed? Guess how long our church had existed for when I had to sign off on the dotted line? 4 months. Status quo would have been like, bro, hold tight. You guys can't handle this. But God was able to overcome. God's favor was able to distinguish. This is what we need. And then you see Nebuchadnezzar recognizing God. Look at verse 28. Blessed or blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And here's what these guys learned. They could have just maintained the status quo. They could have bowed down. They could have forfeited God's presence. But because they didn't, guess who recognizes God as God? This wicked man who was the king and thought he was the God. The power of God displayed in our lives can cause anyone to recognize him as God. The power of God displayed, right? Not talked about, not confined to a Sunday morning worship service, but the power of God displayed in our lives can cause anyone to recognize him as God. And so I want you to think, who is a person at the office that you think would never be able to see God work in your life? Who is the family member? Are these people seeing God work in your lives? And you're like, Ben, you don't know how wicked they are. You don't know how unconcerned with Christianity they are. Do you know anything about Nebuchadnezzar? He was God. Until this moment came, he would have never considered, as we read in the text last week, that there is any God who is able to do things that he is unable to do. And then if you go through the rest of 28, Nebuchadnezzar actually becomes a theologian, which is crazy. I want to give you 5 things from Nebuchadnezzar's mouth that really summarize our entire Rejecting Status Quo series, okay? 5 things from verse 28 that really epitomize what we've talked about all 7 weeks of Rejecting Status Quo. Here we go. The first thing he says is, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel." One of the defining characteristics of living the kind of life we've talked about is that God's nearness is a must as we pursue an opportunity to reject the status quo. We need God's presence. And so he recognizes that God has sent his presence. Secondly, he says, and has delivered his servants, that this God has done the impossible. Right? Wouldn't you say that's pretty impossible? God has done the impossible. Third, who trusted in him. We've said all along that this is about exhibiting faith in a great God. 4, this is what I really enjoy. He says, these men set aside the king's command. Doesn't that sound like rejecting the status quo? What was the status quo? The king's command is the epitome of status quo, right? Because if the king has a command, you do it. And everyone did. And Nebuchadnezzar goes, these guys, He's got to be like gritting his teeth when he says it. They even rejected the king's command. They rejected the king's command. 4th idea, set aside the status quo. 5th, they yielded their bodies. The word yield there literally means to give up to another or to surrender. If you want to reject the status quo, Nebuchadnezzar gives you a great summary on how to do it. God's nearness is a must. Expect God to do the impossible. Trust in him. Set aside the status quo. And number 4, be willing to yield yourselves to another, to him. That comes from Nebuchadnezzar. And as we reach a conclusion in this series, some of us are still wanting to have it both ways. We want to kind of maintain the status quo with our lives, but we also want to get in on what God has for us. You can't have it both ways. You cannot have it both ways, and here's why. You must either reject the status quo and pursue what God has for you, or you must reject the promptings from God to maintain the status quo. You will reject one or the other. What's the pattern of your life? Which one are you setting aside? Promptings from God, status quo. What God has for you, what's pervasive in culture. What seems impossible, what makes tons of sense. Which one are you rejecting? Which one are you setting aside? Which one are you pursuing? Nebuchadnezzar says in verse 29, something that's become a theme around here over the last several days and will continue through Easter. He's still a wicked king, and so now he's just changed who he's after, right? Anyone that speaks against this God will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be ruined. That's a little bit harsh, isn't it? I mean, he's still wicked in some of his ways. And here's why. End of 29. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. How many other gods? How many other plans? For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. God is able. God is able. God is able to save your marriage. I know it's overpowering circumstances. I know how he hurt you. God is able to overcome your addiction. I know it's been with you a long time. God is able to overcome your friend at work's disbelief that God even exists and have you bring him to Easter services next week. God is able. God is able to give our church influence in unprecedented ways in our city. God is able. God is able to take what you see as a little gift and give it a big platform. God is able. And here's how we're going to end this service. In a moment, I'm going to pray. We're going to stand. I'm going to pray. Band's going to come back up to lead us in some reflection and response time. The staff and some others and myself, we're going to walk towards the back. And here's what we want to do during that time. If you're facing something that's overpowering where you just need to know that God is able, we want to pray for you. Nothing that's going to be long and extended, but just to say, hey, you know what, Ben, or you know what, Sean, or you know what, Tim or Lindsay, I need to know that God is able to get me a job. We need to know that God's able to save our marriage. We need to know that God can give us a place to live. We need to know that God can redeem our terrible financial state of being. We just love to pray for you specifically. And if you're here this morning, you're like, Ben, I don't even know if I believe this, and my faith is pretty much non-existent right now. Let me just say this to you. You can borrow ours. Not because it's perfect and not because it's always strong, but we're willing to go to God on your behalf with your thing. We're willing to ask him. We had a great opportunity and privilege to do it during the first service, and we'd love to do it during this. So would you all stand with me?